During the 5th century AD, Britain underwent one of the greatest transformations in its history. For almost 400 years, much of the island had belonged to the Roman Empire. There were Roman towns, villas, military forts, and trading networks. Then Roman rule collapsed, and across the North Sea, new groups of people began arriving. They came mainly from regions that today form parts of northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Later writers called them the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Their arrival would eventually transform much of Britain. They established settlements, created kingdoms, and introduced languages and traditions that would help shape medieval England. Even the name England ultimately came from one of these peoples, the Angles. But this was not simply the story of an invading army arriving one day and conquering the country. The reality was much more complicated. Migration occurred over generations. Some of the newcomers fought, others arrived as families, some took land, others lived alongside the existing British population. And gradually across large areas of eastern and southern Britain, a new society emerged. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. To understand why the Anglo-Saxons were able to establish themselves, we first need to understand what happened to Roman Britain. For centuries, Britain had been protected by the Roman army. But during the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire came under enormous pressure. Germanic groups crossed Roman frontiers in continental Europe. Civil wars weakened imperial authority. Troops were repeatedly withdrawn from Britain to fight elsewhere. By around AD 410, Roman government in Britain had effectively ended. The consequences of this were enormous. The island did not suddenly descend into complete chaos, and some Roman institutions probably survived locally for many years. But there was no longer a powerful central government capable of defending the entire country. Roman military protection disappeared. The system of taxation weakened. Many towns declined. Long-distance trade diminished. Local rulers increasingly had to defend their own territories. In sum, Britain had become fragmented. And across the North Sea were communities with generations of experience in sailing, warfare, and migration. For them, Britain represented opportunity. The term Anglo-Saxon is convenient, but the people arriving in Britain did not originally belong to a single unified nation. The historian Bede, writing centuries later, identified three major groups. Bede associated the newcomers with groups known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, which are traditionally linked to the regions of what are now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Modern archaeology suggests that actual identity and origins of the migrants were probably considerably more complicated. Other groups may also have participated. These societies lived around the North Sea and shared related Germanic languages and cultural traditions. Most were farmers living in relatively small communities. They cultivated cereals, raised livestock, produced textiles, worked iron, and traded along rivers and coastlines. Warriors, of course, also played an important role. Status depended partly upon land, family connections, loyalty, and military reputation. The North Sea was not an impenetrable barrier separating Britain from Europe. It was effectively a highway. Germanic merchants, sailors, mercenaries, and soldiers had probably been travelling to Britain even before Roman rule disappeared. When Roman authority collapsed, these connections became increasingly important. One of the most famous explanations for the Anglo-Saxon arrival comes from later British tradition. According to the 6th century writer Gildas, British rulers invited Saxon warriors into Britain to help defend the country against enemies. Later accounts associated this decision with a ruler traditionally called Vortigern. The newcomers were supposedly given land and supplies in exchange for military service. Then relations collapsed. The Saxons demanded more resources. When they were refused, they rebelled against their employers. According to the traditional story, the mercenaries became conquerors. Exactly how accurate this account is remains uncertain, but hiring Germanic soldiers would not have been unusual. The late Roman Empire had frequently recruited Germanic warriors into its armies. Germanic soldiers may already have been serving in Britain before the Romans withdrew. What probably happened was not one organised invasion, but several overlapping processes. Some migrants may initially have arrived as mercenaries, some would have come independently, and some settlements may have been peaceful. Elsewhere, archaeological and historical evidence point towards conflict. And once successful communities were established, more migrants had a reason to follow. The earliest major settlements appeared largely in eastern and southeastern Britain. That makes geographical sense. These regions were closest to the North Sea routes connecting Britain with northern continental Europe. Migrants crossed in wooden sailing vessels carrying people, tools, weapons, clothing, and all the possessions needed to establish new lives. Importantly, women and children also crossed the sea. This matters because it demonstrates that many of these movements were not simply military expeditions. They were migrations intended to create permanent communities. Modern genetic research has strengthened this picture. A major study of ancient DNA published in 2022 examined hundreds of early medieval individuals and found substantial ancestry connected to continental northern Europe amongst people buried in early Anglo-Saxon England. This evidence indicates that migration was substantial. Among the early medieval individuals examined, researchers found very high levels of continental northern European ancestry. Although the proportions varied considerably between individuals and regions, it shows that the newcomers had not simply conquered Britain, many of them had moved here to live. So, how could migrants from across the sea establish control over such large areas? One important factor was that Britain no longer possessed a united Roman army. Instead, numerous local rulers probably controlled different territories. The Anglo-Saxons therefore did not need to defeat one enormous British kingdom. They encountered a fragmented political landscape. Some settlements may initially have occupied land that was already thinly populated. Elsewhere, newcomers undoubtedly competed with British communities for land and resources. Military victories could then create opportunities for further settlement. Successful warrior leaders attracted followers. These followers required land. Once land had been secured, families could establish farms and villages. More migrants could follow relatives and neighbours who had already crossed the North Sea. This created a process that could expand over generations. But there is no convincing evidence that the existing British population merely disappeared. Many Britons almost certainly remained where they were. Some intermarried with the newcomers, some adopted Anglo-Saxon customs, others moved west towards Wales, Cornwall, and the western parts of Britain. There was also significant migration from Britain to Armorica in northern France, which eventually became known as Brittany. What emerged was therefore not simply a replacement population, it was a new society produced through migration, conflict, and assimilation. The Anglo-Saxons brought agricultural traditions that fitted naturally into much of the British landscape. Most people lived in small rural settlements rather than large towns. Houses were generally constructed from timber. A typical building consisted of wooden posts supporting walls and a thatched roof. Archaeologists have also discovered numerous smaller structures, partly sunk into the ground, traditionally called sunken featured buildings. These may have been used as workshops, storage areas, or living spaces. Fields usually surrounded settlements. Farmers cultivated crops including wheat, barley, and oats. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were important sources of meat and other resources. Oxen could pull ploughs. Sheep produced wool. Animals also represented wealth. Craft production was usually carried out locally. Blacksmiths produced tools and weapons. Potters manufactured containers. Women commonly produced textiles using wool, spindles, and looms. Bone, horn, and wood were turned into everyday objects. The result was predominantly rural economy, very different from the highly urbanized structures associated with the Roman administration. Perhaps the most important Anglo-Saxon contribution was language. The migrants spoke a group of closely related West Germanic dialects. In Britain, these developed into what we now call Old English. Many extremely common modern English words ultimately descend from this language. Words connected with everyday life, including house, bread, water, wife, child, earth, night and day, all have Anglo-Saxon roots. The names of the days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, also preserve associations with Germanic gods. Their language became increasingly dominant across much of what became England. Place names revealed the same transformation. Endings such as ham, meaning a settlement or homestead, appear in towns, for example Birmingham or Nottingham. Ton, derived from a term meaning an enclosure or a settlement, also appeared throughout England. Other names preserve individuals, tribal groups, or features of the landscape. The map itself gradually filled with traces of the newcomers, but language was the only part of what crossed the North Sea. The early Anglo-Saxon settlers were predominantly pagan. Their religious world differed considerably from the Christianity that had become established during Roman rule. They worshipped Germanic gods. Among them were Woden, associated with wisdom and power, Thunor, the thunder god, and Tiw, associated with warfare. Religious practice probably varied between communities. Sacred places, rituals, feastings, and offerings may have all played roles. Burial customs provide some of the clearest archaeological evidence. Some people were cremated and their ashes placed inside urns. Others were buried in graves. Objects could accompany the dead. Men might be buried with swords or shields or spears. Women could be buried with brooches, beads, jewellery, or household objects. These burial customs reveal ideas about status, identity, and how they treated the dead, while many lifestyle choices of jewellery and weaponry also demonstrate strong connections with continental Europe. The styles of jewellery and weaponry found in English cemeteries often have close parallels across the North Sea. The dead carried evidence of migration with them to their graves. Anglo-Saxon society was hierarchical. At its highest levels were powerful kings and warrior leaders. Their authority depended on controlling land and rewarding followers. A successful lord could distribute treasure, weapons, livestock, and territory to loyal warriors. In return, these warriors fought for him. The Great Hall became an important centre of elite society. Here rulers feasted with followers, received visitors, and demonstrated their wealth. Loyalty between warrior and lord became a powerful ideal within Anglo-Saxon culture. Over time, successful leaders expanded their territory. Small communities became large political units. Eventually, several major kingdoms emerged. Amongst them were Kent, East Anglia, Wessex, Mercia, and the kingdoms that became Northumbria. These were not created overnight when the first migrants arrived. They developed gradually as powerful families defeated rivals and absorbed surrounding territories. Migration had begun with scattered settlements, but it was now creating kingdoms. Older versions of the story sometimes portrayed the Anglo-Saxon arrival almost as an extermination or an expulsion of the native British population. Modern evidence suggests something far more complicated. There certainly was violence. Contemporary and later sources describe warfare between British and Anglo-Saxon forces. Some communities were displaced. Anglo-Saxon expansion eventually pushed British political control westwards, but large numbers of Britons remained within areas controlled by Anglo-Saxon rulers. Genetic evidence shows ancestry from both local British populations and continental migrants. The balance varied considerably between different parts of England. Ancient DNA research indicates particularly substantial continental ancestry in parts of eastern England. Culture could also change without anyone physically moving. If an Anglo-Saxon ruler controlled the land, speaking his language and adopting his customs could bring advantages. Over generations, identities changed. Children born from mixed communities might consider themselves members of an emerging Anglo-Saxon society regardless of where all their ancestors originated. This may help explain one of the great transformations of the period. Britain did not merely receive immigrants. Much of eastern Britain gradually became culturally Anglo-Saxon. The transformation took centuries. During the 6th and 7th centuries, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms expanded and competed with one another. Christian missionaries then brought another major change. In 597, a mission led by Augustine arrived in Kent after being sent by Pope Gregory the Great. King Ethelbert of Kent eventually converted to Christianity. Other rulers soon followed. At the same time, Christianity spread from Irish and British Christian communities through northern England. The descendants of pagan migrants were becoming Christian kings, monks, and scholars. Writings expanded, monasteries appeared. Contacts with continental Europe intensified. And gradually the separate histories of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Britons became part of something different. An English identity began to emerge. The settlers had crossed the North Sea carrying their languages, agricultural practices, religious beliefs, weapons, craftsmanship, and local traditions. But they had also entered a land occupied by an established British population whose traditions did not simply vanish. Over generations, these populations fought, they mixed, and they adapted. Roman Britain disappeared. In its place stood a collection of kingdoms that would eventually produce something entirely new. That was England.